as far as the actual elections within the primaries go, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of specific offices that are up for election, but everyone's attention tends to be on the presidential race or, maybe even Ted Cruz and his election. But since there's so many other elections, one, why is there not as much attention on these smaller, maybe even like Texas legislature elections? And two, should there be? Are those important?
Well, they're absolutely important. I mean, I think, first and foremost, part of the reason that the big races get the most attention is because they get the most resources, right? And they spend the most resources. And so they have the ability to get their names out, to get their messages out. And that gets harder and harder as you go down the ballot. I mean, essentially, if you want to say if you want to guess how much money a candidate has raised, you can sort of look at what level of office they are. And as you go down the list, you're going to see less and less money. And money is really necessary to communicate, especially in a state as large as Texas. But even at the local level, it's still really hard to necessarily get your message out in a city as big as Austin or Dallas or Houston, right? At the same time, these races are incredibly important. I mean, ultimately, if you live here in Austin, the Democratic primary is where the contest is going to take place. In November, most Democrats are going to win in this Austin area. It doesn't really matter who they are. So if you want to have an influence, especially over local politics and policy, it is really the primary, and especially here in Austin, the Democratic primary, where you get to actually weigh in and make a choice.
Right. Kind of shifting gears into another policy issue that is kind of on Americans' mind that you also wrote about in your blog, which is about foreign policy and the changing American opinion about how they want the country to stay out, take aid away from Ukraine, Israel, all these sources. And recently there was a pretty substantial uncommitted vote in the Michigan primaries, Democratic primaries. As far as I know, there isn't an uncommitted option on the Texas Democratic ballots, but seeing how these patterns have shifted, one, is Americans' opinions of foreign policy also going to affect the primaries and the main election? And two, will it influence Biden's, maybe not him winning, but how much he wins?
Sure. I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on the primaries. I mean, to the extent that it's having an impact on the Democratic primary at the moment, you are seeing it as you raise, and maybe some sort of protest votes against the president, in particular with having to do with his handling of the Israel-Gaza situation. But looking ahead to the general election, it could have an impact in the sense that one of Biden's strengths when he ran in 2020 was his foreign policy credentials and the fact that he had a very long career with a lot of experience in history, especially in the U.S. Senate, having to dealing with foreign policy issues. To the extent that Americans, but actually in particular Democrats, are having second thoughts about his handling of some of these conflicts, that could lead to some softening of his support that may be consequential, not in some sort of dramatic way, but because the elections are just so close, right? We just have such close presidential elections at this point. One of the questions I think that we're looking at as we go to 2024 is, in some ways, how much support does Biden lose among Democrats? Not that they're going to go vote for Donald Trump, just that they're just not going to show up. And likewise, how much support does Donald Trump lose among Republicans? Again, not that they're going to go vote for Joe Biden, but that they're just not going to show up. So in some ways, in elections that have become increasingly about mobilizing one's own party, there are features of both candidates that make them a little bit less attractive to their own partisans. And for Joe Biden, one of those features might be foreign policy.
Right. Then kind of touching on the Texas primaries again, you guys also talked about how Abbott and Paxton and their campaign endorsements, even though they aren't running this year. So can you tell me a little bit about how those effects have been coming through on polling and how they might come through with the primaries?
Sure. A big, really the main story in a lot of ways for, I think, people who follow Texas politics closely has been efforts by both Greg Abbott and Attorney General Ken Paxton to weigh into Republican primaries for the Texas House against incumbent Republican House members. For Greg Abbott, the main reason he's doing this, or the issue that has led him to do this, it has to do with Republican House members' votes against his desire to establish a school voucher program in Texas. And there's a cadre of about 21 Republicans who joined with all of the Democrats to vote against basically allowing a voucher program in Texas. And Greg Abbott is now, in many cases, actively campaigning against those members. For Ken Paxton, his impeachment is the main reason for his involvement in House primaries, and he's essentially endorsed against every House Republican who voted to impeach him, which is almost all of them,
Right.
and has voted to, and basically has given his endorsement to those who voted not to impeach him. Having said all that, our most recent poll, we asked about the importance to potential primary voters of basically ideology, specific issue alignment with candidates, and endorsements. And endorsements was the third most important among those three. And then we also asked, well, whose endorsement do you care about if you care about endorsements in these House primaries? And Donald Trump was at the top. About 24% of potential Republican primary voters mentioned the former president. About 7% mentioned Greg Abbott. And I think fewer than 2% mentioned the Attorney General, which is not terribly surprising.
Right.
And so that is kind of the big question here. Now, I should say that these endorsements may or may not matter, but what does matter is the fact that the governor is pouring massive amounts of money into these races to try to unseat these incumbents. And in these small districts with these low turnout elections, the real question is that huge inflow of money enough to change the preference of the district?
Right.
In a lot of cases against the Republican incumbents who have received his endorsement in the past,
Right.
and often in many cases have run unchallenged prior to this election cycle.